see you all here. My name is Peter Paquette, and I am the current president of OSHER at Dartmouth. And my role today is pretty limited to some welcomes and some thank yous. So on behalf of OSHER at Dartmouth, I would like to welcome the in-person attendees here in the Lebanon Opera House in Lebanon, New Hampshire. I would also like to welcome the members and non-members who are participating in today's session via live stream. And lastly, I would like to welcome our sister OSHER Lifelong Learning Institutes at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, and the University of Richmond in Richmond, Virginia. No, please hold, please hold, please hold, thank you. Some thank yous. First, I would like to, on behalf of OSHER at Dartmouth, I'd like to thank the members of the 2024 Summer Lecture Series Committee for all your hard work to bring about this extraordinary event. I'd also like to thank the dinner hosts for having the speakers, sponsors, and other guests in your homes. I'd like to thank the volunteers who are working the Lebanon Opera House out front. Thank you very much. Thanks to the Lebanon Opera House for hosting this year's Summer Lecture Series, and to the Lebanon Opera House technical staff for all their help in broadcasting and organizing this year's Summer Lecture Series. And I'd also like to thank our incredible staff for all their marketing and administrative services, without which this event does not occur. And lastly, a special thanks to this year's Summer Lecture Series supporters for their financial support. Our platinum sponsor, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, our gold sponsors, the Caldwell Law Office, Doyle and Lohman, Kendall at Hanover, and the Village at White River Junction, and today's sponsor, a bronze sponsor, Mariner Wealth Advisors. My apologies to anyone that I may have forgotten to thank. So anyways, now you can please give a hand to everybody and thank them and the sponsors. So, thank you. My role is now over, and I'm going to turn this over to the people that you're really here to listen to. So it's now my pleasure to welcome you to today's session. Today's moderator will be Ellen Frost. Ellen Frost is the Adjunct Senior Fellow with the East-West Center in Washington, D.C. Ellen.
Well, thank you, Peter, and I share his words of welcome. I have a few announcements for you. The schedule is roughly like this. After the speaker's presentation, there will be an intermission, followed by Q&A. And we invite you to submit any question that you may have for the speaker at the start of that intermission period. People who are here in person can write their questions on the index cards that you were given. There will be a basket at the stage here, so you can deposit them. And for those of you who are joining us via live stream, you can submit questions using the chat panel on your screen. You enter the questions in the field that says "Say Something," and click the paper airplane icon to send the questions. So we really welcome feedback and questions from you. During the intermission, coffee and pastries will be available downstairs. There is no food and drink allowed in the auditorium. And please be back in your seats by 10:30. We're talking 10 to 10:30 for the break, roughly. There will be a post-lecture discussion held from 11:45 to 12:15 in Suite 380, Classroom A, at 1 Court Street, just a very short walk from where we are now. And for those present, simply walk over there. And for those who would like to attend via live stream, please obtain the link by emailing this OSHER this morning at osher@dartmouth.edu and request the link to participate virtually in the post-lecture discussion. It's now my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker, our keynote speaker, Victoria Holt, who is known to most people as Tori Holt, and her theme is U.S. Global Leadership Challenged. She is the Norman E. McCulloch Jr. Director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth. She has a background in public policy, leadership, and diplomacy. She's had a 30-year career, most of it in Washington. Among other achievements from 2009 to early 2017, she served in the State Department as Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Security in the State Department's Bureau of International Organization Affairs. And among other challenges there, she was responsible for U.S. policy for the UN and UN-related activities, including sanctions and counterterrorism. So I'm now delighted to turn the podium over to Tori Holt, your speaker.
Thank you, Ellen. That's great. Appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Ellen, very much, and for the hosts of this series for inviting me. I think I'm delighted to have heard about this series since I joined the Upper Valley community in 2021. So I'm still a relative newcomer to this area. But I'm very impressed by the series that you have before you. And it's a high job to try and kick that off. But I will say those topics resonate with me as very important, whether you're thinking about threats to democracy, climate change, human displacement and migration, dis and misinformation, and geopolitics and lessons from the Cold War. And to some extent, I find my challenge is how to briefly touch on those, but bring something forward that may help you think about all of those issues in the framework of the leadership challenge that the United States faces today. As Ellen said, my background is more in U.S. international security, but also working in multilateral affairs. And what that has meant is that the United States, particularly since the end of the Cold War, has worked to try and solve its problems whenever possible with alliances, ad hoc coalitions, and within organizations, whether it be NATO, the United Nations, support to the African Union. We have often found that our interests and values are supported greatly when we work with others, and even when others take the lead. So the reason I wanted to talk about this today is I believe in American leadership. I've had the pleasure of working with Ambassador Holbrooke in the end of the Clinton administration. And one of the things he tried to do was not just solve problems, which he did, including bringing the challenge of AIDS to the Security Council and brokering deals in the Balkans and Kosovo, but my job was also to bring lawmakers from Washington to New York to sit in the Security Council, Democrats and Republicans, including Senator Jesse Helms, who at the time completely opposed the UN and threatened to cut off all funding. What he had was a vision that the American spirit, when it's trying to solve problems, can get beyond sort of the arguments that we think we have and roll up their sleeves and try and figure out a way forward. So to some extent, I think that's a moment we're in again today. And I will also say I've seen the United States lead, and coming to the Dickey Center here at Dartmouth and in the Upper Valley, I've come to learn that John Sloan Dickey, after the end of World War II as a diplomat, rather than feeling horrified only by what he had experienced in that war, he came to teach students at Dartmouth to say, the world's problems are our problems, and there's nothing that better humans with the right reasoning and tools cannot fix. And I think that leaves me with inspiration, and I hope to pass that on to you. So what will I do? I will briefly lay out some of the challenges for U.S. leadership today, but I won't delve into most of them because you will be in this series. So then I'll try and talk about one that's not currently in your series, which is how do we manage conflict around the world and why do we care about it? How is geopolitics affecting our ability to manage conflict? And how is the rules-based order still alive or not? What the domestic politics are, a bit about that, and then some ideas for the way forward. But I'm hoping that in our discussion, I will also gain ideas from all of you. So global challenges. We know that since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. has really had a primacy role. Whether you call it unipolar or a superpower, the U.S. with its deep economic reach, its diplomatic presence around the world, its military strength, and frankly, the values it stood up for, we've often been able to pursue our interests and values quite successfully without a major rival. And whether you subscribe to a multipolar world or some other power configuration, we know that's changing right now. that we see rivalries around the world. Just if you read the news yesterday, President Modi of India, after a state dinner in Washington earlier this year, is now in Russia and hugging Putin. We see that Hungary's President Orban, part of Europe and the European Union, is in China and involved in trying to figure out the way forward in Ukraine. Also in Washington is NATO, where the members have come together in advance of having a new Secretary General to think about the future of Europe, the future of security, and what will happen next in Ukraine. And of course, elections around the world. So we know just from the news every day, we see these shifts, and I think it's too soon to know exactly where this will all land. As far as major challenges, some of the ones are obvious that you will think about later this series. Climate change. The year 2023 was the hottest on record. The climate accords, so-called Paris agreements, bring nations together every year to try and take stock on how well they are doing at reducing emissions, moving to renewable energy, and trying to change the very infrastructure of our world in time to cool our Earth and also prevent the worst effects of that climate change, including displacement, changes in desertification, agriculture, and things that would affect everybody on this Earth. None of those things can happen by themselves. It's a good example of how nations must work together. Another major issue, again, a topic for another day, but global health. We've all experienced the COVID pandemic in various ways. The whole world did. And we know that the only way to prevent a future pandemic is to work with all the nations that both track disease, see it spread, come together to try and build vaccinations, and also deliver them in arms. I'm proud that Dartmouth is working on all that. But we know that a future pandemic would affect all of us and could be worse. So I would say that's a leadership challenge. Even as geopolitics step in and people scramble for supply chains and to take care of their own nations, we have to think about how there's collaboration and cooperation. And then finally, one that I grew up with, which is nuclear proliferation and the threat and risk of escalation of a nuclear war. Obviously, since the end of World War II, there have been huge major efforts to constrain the development of nuclear weapons, the testing of nuclear weapons, or the theory that a nation could gain advantage by using them first. Arms control and international efforts, whether at the inspections regimes, treaties, or even convincing nations such as South Africa and former Soviet states to give up their nuclear weapons programs, have given us, we think, more security. But we are now in an era where nuclear arms control agreements are not being crafted, where countries are stepping back from them. There's fears with Russia occupying the Zaporizhzhia, I mispronounced that, Zaporizhzhia close, nuclear power plant in Ukraine, a very dangerous time for all of us, and fears that a nuclear arms race, whether on Earth or in space, could be renewed. So I'm just doing my job, which is laying out some of the major challenges to U.S. leadership. But what I really want to focus on for the rest of this conversation is a fourth area, which is how does the United States prevent conflict, manage it, and prevent its escalation, both for our own interests, preventing our own homeland and our allies from having to face war, but also for the moral good and the practical political goal that conflict is not good for anybody in the world, and that ends up landing on our shores whether we like it or not. Again, if you look at the headlines today, it's pretty unnerving. The war in Ukraine with Russia's recent attack on a children's hospital. Nobody wants to see a surgeon carrying rubble rather than doing a surgery, and that's what we all were greeted with in the last few days. Anybody who follows Sudan knows that 20 years ago, student movements were calling for an end to genocide in Darfur, and very successful peace efforts over time tamped down that conflict. But today, that's renewed. And the pictures of the grand city of Khartoum in Sudan look like it's part of the Middle East. It's been attacked from bombing and civil war. Gang violence in Haiti has also filled American newspapers. And while we're very grateful to see that Kenya is stepping up to send in police forces, it's so close to Florida that we've had waves of migration before, and we feel close to the people there and sad for the experience they have of no governance, corruption, and gang violence. And of course, the Middle East and what's going on there, as we all remain hopeful for a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza, more humanitarian access for the people there, prevention of a greater, wider war with Hezbollah, Lebanon, and even the Houthis in Yemen and beyond. All of these can easily occupy our minds. So I think that we know that the United States cares about these conflicts, not just morally, also because of our interests and the alliances we support. As Ellen pointed out, most of my career after the end of the Cold War was trying to prevent, mitigate, recover from some of these conflicts. I've spent time in helicopters in eastern Congo, flying in to see peacekeepers. I have been to Darfur and seen the burned out cities that recovered. I've spent time talking to diplomats in China, Moscow, Europe. So all of this comes from my personal and perhaps very practical view that when we want to solve problems, first we identify them, we analyze them, then we roll up our sleeves and figure out what to do. And that's why I want to bring attention a bit to how multilateral institutions work, what the theory is, then talk a bit about the trends that they are addressing and we are trying to address, and then think about how geopolitics is further challenging that, and then where do we go? So, what's the international system that I'm assuming we all know about? A very brief sketch, but I could get into this more. As we know, after World War II, the United Nations was set up as one of the predominant organizations meant to prevent threats to international peace and security. The United States is one of 5 countries that has a permanent vote, a veto even, on the Security Council, and serves with elected 10 members who come for 2-year rotations. It's still a prized place to be. Even though it may not be in our daily news, the Security Council agenda covers every conflict in the world, nuclear proliferation, terrorism and counterterrorism efforts, humanitarian access increasingly, and ways to prevent types of war. Let me give you a few examples. In the early 1990s, our headlines were filled with not just the end of the Cold War, but countries going into conflict internally, intrastate conflict, something that the world had not really grappled with before. In those early days of the 90s, the UN, in a burst of enthusiasm and freed from the US-Soviet rivalry, sent in a series of peacekeeping missions to Haiti, to Sierra Leone, to the Balkans, to Rwanda, Cambodia, Mozambique, Angola, Central America. Many of them failed. And the reason they failed is they didn't have a political strategy backing up what was traditionally an observer mission. They were unprepared for violence within countries and did not know how to respond when atrocities were committed, such as in the Balkans, were safe areas, men and women were being rounded up, or the Rwandan genocide. So instead of, there was a retrenchment. There was a period in the mid-90s, everyone said, okay, forget the UN, forget peacekeeping, let's just go to regional organizations. Let's just go to ad hoc coalitions. But an interesting thing happened after that. So by the late 90s, suddenly wars were coming to an end. Eastern Congo had a peace agreement. There was a ceasefire between Ethiopia and Eritrea. The United States had supported Australia going into East Timor to both prevent atrocities but help a government stand up. We saw the British deploy their own forces into Sierra Leone to stop rebel groups. And all of these nations turned and said, hey, we can't keep carrying, we've secured this country, we've ended the immediate threat, but how do we help this place recover from conflict? So the world turned again back to the United Nations. And by then, some really smart things had happened. People recognized, as they still do today, that while security is job one, countries and societies can't recover from conflict unless they can trust it will stick. They need to know that political leaders are committed to this. They need institutions of rule of law, reasonable police, courts that will take up cases of injustice. So suddenly, at the end of the Clinton administration and in the Bush administration, these whole missions got redesigned. They were redesigned to have the ability to use force if necessary, if civilians came under attack, and they were there to work with political partners to try and rebuild societies. The Bush administration actually said, how do we have this happen after they went into Iraq? They're like, where's the UN mission when we need one? What about other than 100 countries in the world serving in them? Just a couple examples you may have heard of. When there was an earthquake in Haiti in 2010, nearly 100 UN employees were crushed in the rubble. The rest refused to leave. They not just removed the rubble, they helped the US fly into the airport, delivering humanitarian assistance and trying to rebuild from that. I've also seen resilience in places like Cote d'Ivoire, not in our newspapers, but there was an election in late 2010, and 2 people said, I'm president. And in a real-time moment, the Security Council called the elections, and instead of going to civil war, basically tried to hold the line for 5 to 6 months, and the country maintained peacefulness after quite a period. I just give a couple examples, and I'm happy to give more. So my point is that messy, complicated, not perfect. Not all these countries are forever perfect, but wow, what an amazing tool that was developed out of past crises. So I'll just mention a few other areas behind the scenes in the multilateral world that I've lived in. When the U.S. wanted to see what was going on somewhere and we were doing mediation, we would often also turn to the good offices of the international community. Sometimes it's the Catholic Church, sometimes it's the Department of Political or Peacebuilding Affairs at the UN, cadre of people who know how to negotiate and support that work. We've also supported political missions around the world. It's not always UN peacekeeping with military and civilians and police. It could be a small political unit that comes in and understands what's going on. Or a mechanism like CSAC in Guatemala, which helped Guatemala with its own institution of its laws and go after corruption. Regional organizations, there's too many for me to list. The big ones, perhaps, the European Union, African Union, Economic Community of West African States, the OAS, Organization of American States, the Arab League, ASEAN in Asia. These are all like behind the scenes, but they're organizations that are meant to manage these conflicts. And the U.S. has ambassadors to all these countries. We work with them, we sometimes fund them, and we stand back because they may do a better job than we would in trying to understand what's happening locally. So we also have problems in the world that won't be persuadable without some pressure. And one of the toolkits for the international system is sanctions. They are meant to be coercive. They are meant to be short of war. They are meant to pinch and hurt. One of the lessons after the sanctions on Iraq was that some leaders push the pain onto their own populations. So another reform was something called targeted sanctions. Rather than going after the population, having a full embargo or stopping all trade, you could go after the leaders who were not cooperating and supporting peace in their own country. And it was interesting. I met some of these leaders who were sanctioned at one point. Their wives like to fly to Europe. They like to fly to Europe, go shopping, have lovely lives. And travel bans were an amazing way to prevent that. And it was quite obnoxious to them. Same thing, arms embargoes. If you've ever seen a map of the world, it's pretty hard to monitor all those borders. But there's a normative side to this, that if you're an arms salesperson, you don't want to sell to a country there's an arms embargo. So again, not a perfect tool, but these targeted sanctions did help contain violence. And what came with them, often, were panels of experts who would tromp around with notebooks and trench coats and try and figure out who were selling the guns, who was violating targeted sanctions, where the financial flows were coming. These are amazing mechanisms, and so much so that they're debated fiercely in the Security Council because they have an impact. Other mechanisms you will hear about in future talks, but non-proliferation and counterterrorism are two others. Regimes against North Korea, DPRK, and Iran were meant to constrain their ambitions for proliferation of nuclear weapons. They had more comprehensive sanctions that could really have reach. We also, as part of the multilateral system, put financial flows on stop for financial flows to terrorists and tried to constrain banks that had ambiguous support to accounts. The UN also had the ambition, supported by us and other organizations, to limit the kinds of war that were in our world. Interestingly enough, at the end of the Bush administration, the ambassador of the UN, Khalil Azad, got very interested in how do you stop sexual violence and conflict. And I went to a conference in the UK on this, and I remember thinking, how the heck are you going to stop sexual violence and conflict? This seemed like a lovely idea, but near impossible. But he persisted, and with the support of other nations, and then with us when I joined government, you realize that rape as a measure of war has been going on for centuries, but you could say that that is not acceptable. You could start working with both rebel groups, governments, and others to say, this is not all right. We are monitoring you. Let us help you train your forces. Let us help you lead. Let's help you understand you cannot win war successfully with this. If you destroy your enemy so much, you will never have a lasting peace. And to this day, there's an office dedicated to this that analyzes this and raises this issue regularly. So, has it worked perfectly? No, but it has taken that norm another step, as it has for trying to get children out of armed conflict. Governments of the world are worried about the annual report on this, that they get listed in this. So the normative framework of some of these mechanisms, I think also, I've seen have been quite powerful. So those are a few examples of what I'm talking about, of the architecture after the end of the Cold War that I think the United States has really cared about and benefited from, and benefited in part in my view, because it keeps things off the president's desk. If we have agreements with other countries to try and stop these kinds of conflicts, have them recover, and then try and outlaw the worst instincts of people, that's a benefit to us. So, why am I bringing this up? Because the trends are pretty tough right now. So let me go through some of those before I get to what happens next. I remember looking at statistics when I went into government in 2009, and it was a much cheerier world. Conflicts had been down, interstate conflicts were reduced, and the threat of interstate war was very low. But if you look at some of the major organizations that track these trends, they have a general consensus that conflict is up. Displacement, refugees, IDPs, those fleeing wars are up, and the escalation between major powers has increased. So maybe start there. The ultimate interest is the United States does not want to go to war, and it does not want war for its allies and friends. It doesn't want war in general between sovereign states. And so one of the risk factors for this is if regional conflicts grow, escalate, and continue, and get internationalized. The Institute for Economics and Peace has found that, quote, many of the conditions that precede major conflicts are higher than they have been since any time since the end of the Second World War. There are currently, according to them, 56 active conflicts, also the most since the end of the Second World War. And fewer of these conflicts are being resolved. And this is sort of an interesting point, that they noted that the number of conflicts that ended in a decisive victory fell from 49% in the 1970s to 23% to 4% over the same period. More recently. So what's happening is, rather than having the conflict ended, it goes low and maybe gets submerged and can come back to life. The humanitarian consequences are well known to this. At the end of 2023, this number sort of is amazing. 117 million people, imagine how many people that is worldwide, were forcibly displaced as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights, and events disturbing public order. Not, I need a good job, I want to go to another country. They're trying to capture those who are forcibly displaced. So the regional consequences to this also are fairly severe. We know that regional conflicts such as the Russia-Ukraine war and what's happening between Israel and Gaza have devastating human costs. The calculation is that roughly 2,000 fatalities per month for every month since Russia most recently went into Ukraine. In Gaza, I think the rough number is 35,000 deaths since October, including those killed in the October 7th attack. So, unfortunately, it sounds like 2022 was the first year of over 200,000 battle deaths since Rwandan genocide killed that many people in 1994. All right. Now, if those who care about geopolitics, you also recognize that some of the effects that I'm describing come from a change in the relationship between the United States, Russia, China, but also other powers, so-called middle powers, relatively wealthy countries who are playing a greater role in the regions, and competition has intensified, and they are not necessarily working just with one country or the other. So the shift in the geopolitical landscape is partly responsible for some of these major changes, such as unresolved conflicts, but also maybe a more limited bandwidth for the international community. So a few factors in this. The numbers I'm describing would overwhelm any system. I don't mean just the American, but if you look at UNICEF or UNHCR, the World Food Program, some of the international organizations created to take care of the feed and caring of those displaced by conflict or refugees, these numbers just far outpace what they were designed to handle. And with that comes financial implications. The Security Council itself has been facing huge geopolitical shifts, and I'll get to that in a second, but we watch more vetoes being used, less cooperation, peacekeeping missions being abstained from, an area that often had traditionally large support. Leaders like the United States are also focused on climate change, nonproliferation, pandemics, authoritarian organizations. So just keeping up with all of this at a time when you have multiple grand challenges, the bandwidth is not always there for the United States and its allies at the same time. So let me give you a little bit more about the multipolar piece. I want to give you maybe an example that most people point to. So when you go to a conversation about this, say in I went to Europe last fall, and the focus was really on the moment we were in with Russia's most recent invasion of Ukraine. And on one hand, people were pleased that the Europeans, broadly speaking, had come together to resist this invasion by Russia. And they really were questioning, however, if the rules-based order would hold, and whether we were in a multipolar environment and what to do. And some thought, okay, we're done with the system we have, we need a new one. Others were arguing, nope, let's buck up, we can keep the system going. But they all pointed to the earlier time when Russia went into Crimea in 2014. And I was really struck, and I said, well, I actually think we should start 2 years earlier, in 2012. It wasn't just Russia going into Crimea, it's the war that happened in Syria and what it demonstrated to us about the changing global dynamics and the ability to prevent aggression. So let me briefly walk you through what I mean by that. In 2011, as part of Arab Spring, peaceful protests broke out in Syria against the regime, unarmed, mostly disorganized. And the regime basically started cracking down quite hard. They arrested protesters. The Security Council took notice of this and tried to pass a Security Council resolution to condemn the violence and restrain arms to the region. And for the first time later that year, both Russia and China vetoed a resolution in this area. Double vetoes are unusual. They don't usually happen in the Security Council. The veto is meant to be a very dramatic thing. The U.S. usually uses it, say, in the Middle East, but we rarely use it otherwise. So the Arab League came back with a resolution in 2012. It was also vetoed by China and Russia. The draft condemned the violence in Syria and supported the Arab League's 22 January decision to facilitate a Syrian-led political process. They said no. The war started to spread. Hezbollah, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Force came in. Successive diplomats, some of the best in the business. If you've heard of Kofi Annan, Lakhdar Brahimi, Jean-Marie Gaheno, these were folks who were asked as international diplomats to try and negotiate a peace. Didn't work. Chemical weapons started being used in Syria by the regime. This is really something that's been banned since World War I, still used, but very limited way. UN experts were sent to investigate. They found the sources. Their resolutions were blocked. There was no accountability for that. General Mood of Norway led an observer mission into Syria, calling to halt the violence and unarmed tried to deter the wider spread of conflict. After 3 months, he quit. He said, this is not working. We do not have goodwill in the field. It's going to continue. Bombings continued of safe areas, and the humanitarian cargoes that were being sent in were attacked. The Security Council failed most of the time to condemn that. Russia, again, blocked many of those resolutions. And by 2014, 2015, the Islamic State had come in, which then got American attention in addition as a core terrorist threat. So after 12 years of this, the Syrian refugee crisis was one of the worst in the world. They had roughly 5.2 million refugees, and they all fled locally, right? Or Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey. But many of us also saw the flow to Europe and the destabilization of Europe as a result of that. It was one of the worst humanitarian crises, and the chemical weapons, unfortunately, are continuing to be used today. So I would say that the world's lack of response to that also made a difference, not just Crimea and Ukraine, but we watched some of the big norms and the political challenges the world faced basically be allowed to continue. And I don't have an easy answer to it, but I wanted to bring us back. So that's roughly 10 years ago. So from this, we learned also that host nations that supported peacekeeping missions learned how to push back. They started limiting freedom of movement. They would ask for UN flight routes before the helicopters would fly, even if they were delivering aid. And Khartoum, for example, would hold up visas for UN employees. So we see these lower level sort of power stretch to challenge the Security Council and to see if they would back up their missions. And in general, they sometimes did, they sometimes did not. And I think in part what was going on was that this had become such an infrastructure with such confidence of the world that it worked, that it went from being a strategic level interest for most governments, including ours at times, to something that could be managed in the field. But what I think was happening was this erosion was beginning to grow. It's like water in your basement. If you don't make sure it's gone, it will eventually erode some of the norms and the ability to deliver on your interests. And in fact, I think a lot of autocrats learned this. You know, I think what we saw is countries that did not want to be told about human rights and rule of law democracy and the fact they need to show up at the peace agreement meetings, learned that, oh, I can kind of get away with not necessarily doing that. And at the same time, I think the United States has also partly disengaged from this conversation. We have often been caught up more recently in debates about whether we should be in Afghanistan and Iraq, what the use of force should be, what our needs are here at home, all very important conversations, or terrorism. And again, I think we often thought, we figured this out, different people can worry about this, it shouldn't be on the president's desk, but over time, this erosion, I think, has then filled in a space where we need to pay attention again. And one of the reasons we need to pay attention again is for geopolitics. So the Russia and China double vetoes have also led, there's quite a bit of debate, to some form of alliance. It's not clear how deep that goes, but at least China and Russia have worked together to block U.S. interests and action and have been increasingly wooing parts of the world. In the case of China, they've also flooded the UN with money. They've given them an immense amount of funding in an area. They've provided troops. They're now the largest peacekeeping contributor as a permanent member of the Security Council. And to their credit, have dirt on their shoes and street cred about most of these missions, including sending combat troops to South Sudan and hosting conferences on these issues. Their trust fund is what I'm told by colleagues in the UN Secretariat is the thing that keeps the UN running in many cases. And while the Americans have the senior post, say, for the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, we provided virtually no funding. And that office has to go begging for funds around the world. So they've figured out soft power to some degree. And whether or not that will fundamentally change how it works is a source of debate. There have been times where they oppose human rights staff, they oppose protection of civilians, they argue for sovereignty. So you can see a very long-term strategy that maybe shifts the way this very international system works from what has been a Western, US-based sort of system to one that's more to their liking. Russia, at the same time, has defended African countries that do not want to have peacekeeping mission and also provided the Wagner Security Group as a competitor for security in countries where UN peacekeepers have operated and often been challenged by their efforts. So that's a larger thing, but I think that geopolitics in the UN system is no surprise. It's always been contested. It's the nature of the organization. It's where we should be duking it out on issues. But what I'm watching is a shift in the United States having a primacy not just because of our diplomacy, but because we fund the organization, we show up for every meeting, we make a case, we basically have a dominant role. And that power base has shifted to a point where I fear that what we've treated multilateral a lot is something we don't want to worry about, let the president worry about the big stuff. I think we need to push back and say, hey, if we want to prevent conflict, if we want to have these organizations function, then we need to really increase our engagement in many of these areas. Now, the U.S. has some flaws as well. I think the U.S. invasion of Iraq will forever be a sign that the U.S. may not be sincere about asking for authorization of use of force and its repercussions, but I will draw a distinction with Russia's behavior in Ukraine. The U.S. passed, I think, over 50 resolutions and supported, the UN supported resolutions on Iraq, laying the groundwork. After we went in and it was not approved by the Security Council, the U.S. sought to work with the UN to rebuild and support that. So instead of violating everything, and again, I think this was a major flaw, the U.S. looked to restore its relationship and support efforts that the UN was doing. So I would draw a distinction there. However, we have also withdrawn over the years from the World Health Organization, from the UN, UNESCO, which is the Educational and Science Organization, from the Human Rights Council, and even from the Paris Climate Accords. We are now back in those, but I think one of the challenges is whether we stay in them, and we have a choice to make. So let me go to that, domestic issues, really briefly, and then I can wrap up. Most presidents don't really think about what the role in the world is, per se. If you read national security strategies, they're kind of consistent. We work with allies and alliances, we serve our interests and our values, and there we are. However, if you look at President Clinton, who came in much more enthusiastic about embracing this, and during the 90s really got beaten up over the civil conflicts that erupted on his watch, he kind of stepped back a bit and said, okay, we're going to have more modest views. We're going to strengthen these institutions. He wanted to focus on the economy, but let's make this work. And in an odd way, President Bush also did the same. He came in skeptical of international organizations and the sort of international social work. But after Iraq and Afghanistan, he's like, holy cow. They had conflicts in West Africa. Haiti blew up again. I mentioned East Timor earlier. And his team actually supported the greatest increase in peace operations for its time and the expansion of mandates, again, at a very pragmatic, wow, this tool can work. We need to work with other countries. So that just, as a moment, put that there. I find in general, Democrats don't really want to think about all this. They generally want to focus on the economy and domestic issues. I would say that was also true originally for President Obama, who I worked for. However, the world happens. And after the Arab Spring, we need mechanisms for political peace in Libya, the conflict I mentioned in Cote d'Ivoire, Sudan and South Sudan, separating into two separate nations, what was happening in Mali with state collapse, in Central African Republic with ethnic cleansing, Ebola in Liberia. I mean, the list just blew up. And so the instinct was, okay, how do we best work with other countries? And most nations work within international institutions because they can't have embassies around the world. We have that choice. And so it was often the most effective and efficient way to constrain the proliferation of nuclear weapons, go after ISIS and foreign terrorist fighting, help states recover from conflict. Hey, we even got the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty agreed to by the Security Council. So it was a mechanism to broaden these efforts, so a form of burden sharing that became, I think, over time, nonpartisan. Lots of arguments about the details, but broadly speaking. But the politics today have brought us back to maybe what I saw in the 90s. There's actually a vote today in the House Foreign Affairs Committee about whether the United States should completely defund all the UN system. And it's, I think, sponsored in part by the chair, who's a very reasonable guy. It's like, how do we get there? Like, really? You don't want any of this system to be funded by the United States. You're going to let China step into the space. You're going to let Russia have a free hand. You're going to let the autocrats really have their say. And it's because it's framed without any of that, I think, conversation. It's framed much more domestically, which is, we are mad at the UN because they disagree with us on Israel, and they want to support Palestinian rights. And so they're linking it to that and that alone. And I just find that this shows me that we're not having the right conversation. We are not tying the American people's views, even some of our legislators' views, to the practical reasons that we work in these systems, not because we're being nice only, or moral, which we are, but because they also serve our interests on so many fronts. So I think we also have a debate at the presidential level about alliances and coalitions. We know that President Trump, the candidate for the Republicans, has said in the past a wide variety of things on NATO. I think there's a lively debate about whether he would actually withdraw or not. But nonetheless, we see the Europeans very nervous, and that his desire to end the war in Ukraine, is that cutting a deal with Putin? Is that something else? So I think there's a time of jitteriness even with our closest allies. So I think that the domestic side of this needs to get reconnected to the actual world. And I don't know exactly how to do that, but the consequences are high. They're high because you may be worrying about China and Taiwan. They're high because you're worried about the rise of authoritarianism and anti-democratic forces. They're high because we've got conflicts around the world and displacement. The United States is worried about refugees and migration. So a couple ideas. It's not all grim. I heard a recent interview with the new head of government in Haiti, and the guy was amazing. He's like, I'm a Haitian. We have to stand up. We need to solve these problems. We need the world to help us, but this is our job. And like people like that, I think a lot of times the countries in conflict are the ones who have the voice about what should happen next. And I have watched our foreign policy community shift to think more not just what we think as Americans, but what are actually the views of those around the world for whom we could then work with, could support them in what to do. I also think there's a lot of pushback. I've mentioned Ukraine a number of times. I think the Europeans are more united, even though the politics are all over the map between elections in France and the UK, Eastern Europe. But I think that there's a core belief that their security is together and that they need to stop Russia's intervention in Ukraine, both for the fact of it and because it demonstrates a violation of the rules-based order, territorial integrity, and what they believe all sovereign nations should enjoy, which is freedom from being invaded. So I think that some other areas, what I'm talking about, I think, is also put a bit more into the public view. I think the Middle East has become part of a public dialogue, and people are like, why is it this way? What is the solution? Is a two-state solution possible? What about the wider dynamics? And I think when there's conversations like that, we can bridge back to the American people about what's going on. So that's not a super long list. I will add there's a lot in the weeds. There will be a summit coming up, a summit for the future. There will be discussions more about conflict prevention early. The World Bank rolled out fragility, conflict, and violence strategy, which said if we care about development, we got to start earlier. We will work with fragile states. I think there's more of a conversation about how energy policy relates to all of this as well. But I do remain hopeful that with ingenuity and clear-eyedness about the challenges we face, that we can think about once more reforming, reshaping, and supporting our alliances, our coalitions, and these international institutions, which definitely feel wobbly, but are really important and can continue to deliver. And I will just say, Security Council last year probably passed so many more resolutions than I've listed. So there is more unity than there is disagreement. And the very fact that we track on the vetoes means that people are paying attention and trying to reform this. So that is a broad, here's another thing to worry about. Leadership challenge for the United States. I think it's one that will maybe relate to the other topics that you'll have. When you hear about the other issues, you'll be thinking about, oh, here's what the United States does, but how do we work with other countries, not always agreeing with them? As diplomats frequently say, diplomacy is about working not just with your allies, but with your enemies to try and craft a way forward. But I think it's an important endeavor, and I look forward to the conversation with you about it. Thank you. I'm not sure who I hand the podium to, because I think we have a bit of a coffee break, right, Ellen? So, do we reconvene here at some time? All right, well, thank you so much.
I have to start. It would take me hours. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started on the question and answer period. As predicted, the number of really good, tough questions came flooding in, so many that I won't be able to address all of them word for word, and I want to apologize in advance for not being able to do that. But in the meantime, I'm going to pop a number of questions at Tori, some of them grouped together, some of them stand alone, and let's see how she deals with them. Well, you talked a lot about the UN, so the first question is, what can we do to increase the effectiveness of the UN? So start with that one.
I can see this will be a lot of softballs. Okay. Well, first of all, nice to see everybody here, and thank you again for inviting me in. It's an impressive turnout for a morning. So the word effectiveness is really interesting if we're asking how the UN can be effective, because there's at least three major roles it plays, and maybe we judge it differently. So one is theater, right? It's where countries go to give speeches, let off steam, argue behind the podium. I remember, I mentioned Syria a few times, you know, when our ambassador was Samantha Power, she was dealing with the Russian ambassador, they would give these fiery speeches in the Security Council. And then they go into the small room nearby and go like, okay, what's really going on? And they would negotiate something. Or they'd at least let each other know what the red lines were for each country. And that is up and down the whole scale, right? The corridor conversations are part of the usefulness, if not the effectiveness, of that fora. Other effectiveness measures is to the extent that people are hashing out resolutions I mentioned on, say, values. No children in armed conflict, stopping sexual and gender-based violence, promoting the role of women, caring about sustainable energy. It tries to normalize how countries view their role in the world and their moral aspirations. So how do you measure that? If countries vote for it, it's one measure, yes. And then the third is the operational wing of the United Nations, which is everything from providing electoral support, humanitarian assistance around the world. You know, our aviation standards are monitored and supported out of Montreal at one of the UN agencies. The IAEA sets standards for nuclear weapons. So I think there's a practical delivery of services. So on all three, I might measure effectiveness differently. I think the area that I would like to maybe improve upon is make sure that we push the UN to reform on delivery of services. We expand the imagination on how they can react to the moment, and that we all show up. So I believe the U.S. should pay its dues, for example, and then that would give us more of a bully pulpit to push back when other countries are arguing that we don't deserve it. So those are a few thoughts. I could get into more details.
Can you just elaborate on the one thing you mentioned about paying dues? And when I worked in the Senate staff in 1972, that was already an issue. We were trying to be effective and we weren't paying our dues.
Right, and it gives, as our current ambassador says, China a talking point in every meeting. It's given Cuba talking points over the years. The U.S. earlier this year owed $1 billion just in peacekeeping, which we vote for and support on the UN Council. And some of it is held up by Congress because there's no domestic repercussions to that. So that's what I was talking about earlier, is the disjuncture between domestic engagement in issues and the international effects, and how those two have become kind of separated and not linked back to each other.
There were several questions about information. What sources of information would you point us to be able to be better informed than just the major news outlets? That's one. Another one is that Sudan is poorly understood by the media. Why and how do similar conflicts gain attention? So that's a media question. Questions?
I think for many of us, just getting good information is increasingly both challenging and potentially available. News is no longer just in a single newspaper or a magazine in ways that many of us grew up with. And that sort of democratization of information is both thrilling, because as one of our colleagues here said, you know, he's reading directly newspapers published in Israel and seeing the diversity of views there. That's a fantastic thing to be able to do. But you can also go on Twitter or social media and not know if what you're reading, as is recently reported, is a bot farm, or if it's actually a citizen in Minnesota, or actually the news coming out of South Sudan. So I think there's no single answer to this. I personally have turned increasingly to organizations, and some of the statistics I mentioned that are dedicated to tracking certain topics, who have reliable transparency on their funding sources. You recognize some of the names on the board of directors. You see that they hire local people to publish information. So, for example, International Crisis Group covers the world and conflicts, and they argue internally about some things, but their stuff is vetted. So if you're interested in a Sudan or you're interested in a conflict, I think that's one of the sources I would recommend. I also turn to a lot of these international organizations I've mentioned. They're full of international employees, so there's no one point of view, and their statistics and data collection can be extraordinarily good. So those are just a couple thoughts. I also believe in newspapers and magazines. But.
There were a couple of questions about sanctions, which is a subject I've actually written about. And one question was, do they work? And they may be better than military intervention, but critics think they give rise to black markets and punish the wrong people, and they don't work. So can you expound a bit on UN sanctions and anything else related to sanctions?
Yeah. So the sanctions regimes I know best are the ones that are supported by the United States, but are also approved and supported by the UN Security Council. And there's a distinction. The United States' economic power and our supplies are so great that if we decide at the national level to have sanctions, we can have an impact. But in general, at least when I was in government, we tried to have all sanctions adopted by the Security Council because then all nations would both politically be involved, which is a very powerful signal, but also would be expected to implement that. So multilateral sanctions, I mentioned some earlier, were strongest on trying to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, such as in North Korea, DPRK, or in Iran. And we passed comprehensive sanctions, relatively speaking, for both countries, which meant that there was even a case where a ship in Panama was stopped because its route included providing supplies to North Korea that could support its nuclear weapons program. So I think that that can be both operationally effective and certainly it sets a bar that nations are expected to live up to even if it's hard. Two more thoughts. It's still really hard to implement sanctions. I ran a project many years ago, and we downloaded all the sanctions regimes the United Nations had, and with a researcher, we started saying, okay, then there are these panels of experts to go and try and identify who is running the guns, who is the illegal aircraft coming into countries, where are the financial flows, and we said, let's track all their recommendations to fix this. So we started calling up our colleagues at the UN and we can't track that. So I was like, okay. And so we cold called about 20 missions at the UN, which are supposed to take the sanctions approved by the Council, there's something called a note verbal, send it to their capital, and then magically implement it. And I think we found 2 countries that could tell us they were implementing it. So the chain between the Security Council decision and the ability to implement was hard. And that's even true for the United States. If you've got a list of everybody on a sanctions regime, say terrorist regime, you have to provide that to every border officer at every port, at every airport. It's a high challenge. So I think that the functionality on some of this is changed. Last point on sanctions, they're meant to be slow motion. I think diplomats often turn to the toolkit, and sanctions is usually on the list. What do we do? There's a crisis. How about sanctions? And the caution is that whatever you implement will send a signal immediately, but the actual bite, the change on the ground will take a long time to have effect. I mentioned Cote d'Ivoire, and there were sanctions put on its financial flows, but it took quite a few months to basically stop the money coming into the central bank, which was ultimately one of the main levers over former President Gbagbo, who was arguing he had been elected, not Ouattara. But it did work. So you have to kind of calibrate your expectations. Last quick thing, I think everybody's talking about sanctions because of Russia and trying to isolate them after the most recent invasion of Ukraine. I think it has had a huge impact, but not a full impact. Obviously, we're seeing Russia. I mentioned Modi's in India. India is buying fuel from Russia, which we have sanctioned. So they're not perfect, but they do send a signal. They can have operational impacts, and it is a coercive measure short of war.
Well, not surprisingly, a number of questions had to do with the upcoming election and Presidents Biden and former President Trump. Many of the questions you posed asked about the risk For example, pulling out of NATO, and might that actually be a good thing? Or what do our allies fear the most about the result of the election? I invite you to comment on the current political climate and what it does for us overseas.
Well, thank you. One of the pleasures of working at the Dickey Center is we host an annual conference in Washington, and that mixes Dartmouth academics and expertise with government officials and with think tank people. And so these were some of the topics that we included this year. We had folks who had come from Europe to talk to us, and we had some expertise from Dartmouth on polling, international and domestic public opinion. And I think the question you're asking about allies is definitely wobbly. Europe is pretty upset and concerned about the U.S. being a reliable partner. Part of that is just feeling there's a lot of flip-flopping in the U.S. changing positions every 4 years with elections and wondering how this will get stabilized. I think most acutely it's about Ukraine. Former President Trump has offered very different views than current President Biden about support to Ukraine and whether and how to treat Russia. But if you look more closely, I think there's still debate within the Republican Party. As you saw on the Hill, when Biden asked for additional aid for Ukraine, it took a really long time because there was an internal fight. But in the end, Republican Speaker, working with some of the leadership in his party and some of the Democrats, did pass that aid. So I can't predict in the end which way, if President Trump is elected, that would actually go. And to your question, there have been threats to pull out of NATO, and you wouldn't have to actually pull out to do damage. I think Congress passed legislation during the first Trump administration that banned or prevented somehow, if you look it up, the U.S. pulling out of NATO. But you can imagine lots of other ways to do this. You could reduce funding. You could stop going to summits. You could cut deals. You could still withhold funding to Ukraine. You could reduce military exercises. So it's a diplomatic format organization as well as a military alliance. And so I think there's a lot of play within there that could make a difference.
Looking back at history, was a question here, was Obama's failure to respond to the red line in Syria on chemical weapons a big mistake?
I think I have a couple ways of answering that. I think in general, the United States, when it lays down a red line and then backs off and doesn't uphold it, regardless of why, does damage to the whole point of red lines and deterrence. And so on that area, I don't think I'm alone in arguing that did damage to our reputation in the world. Particularly as I laid out with Syria, if we had foreseen the consequences of the refugee crisis and its impact on Europe, if we had foreseen how much that crisis gave Russia a toehold in Syria with its base, with Iran in that area, the destabilization of the region, maybe we had a different view. If we had foreseen the damage done by a nation's government to its own people, violating the principles of sovereign responsibility for the protection of their own civilians, it might have been a different calculation. I wasn't in the White House. I've read the same books you have. I was part of the State Department, but there was a point where we knew that military action after Syria disarmed most of its chemical weapons was off the table. Are we glad we reduced the chemical weapons there? Yes. But they went ahead and used more chemical weapons, and there was no accountability, another norm that was shifted. So I think in that case, I believe that there should have been more creativity. If not, we shouldn't draw red lines if we don't hold up to them in general, or we need to really lay out another set to go forward. But I do think that that was one of the errors that we made.
There's a question here about the role of Iran in the Middle East, and can our troubles in the Middle East be tracked to our own, I think the word is vision of Iran?
Ellen and I were talking earlier about when in your career you look at what issues you could work on in the international arena where you think you can make a difference. And so I never became a Middle East expert in part because the deep history there and the complexity of the conflict was one that I thought I could make more of a difference elsewhere. So I'm no expert on this. But could you just repeat the idea of Iran? What was the question?
Do our current troubles, can they be traced to our view of Iran? I would maybe rephrase some of it. Iran is known for funding groups in the Middle East that disrupt the status quo and
Yeah.
promote radical
Yeah.
groups. And as someone who's visited Iran, it's a wonderful place, actually. Once you get past the scowling guards in the airport, it's a country that's rich in culture and history and archaeology and so on. But it does seem as if we're sort of inching closer to not attacking Iran, but for blaming them for Lebanon and Houthis and all of these other groups. But I'm elaborating here, and I shouldn't, so.
No, you should. This is a
Take away
conversation.
any way you want. Yeah.
You know, I think the practical question for me would be, how do we help support the countries in the Middle East, stabilize relations, prevent an escalation of war further? In the case of Iran, not have them, they're very close to having nuclear weapons capability, I understand. I don't know that personally. Those are reports I read. They are supportive of Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen, so as a destabilizing force. But how do you balance that out? How is there a conversation, as you said, with the whole country and what the people there want? The recent election demonstrates there is a debate in Iran about its future and where it will go. So I think that's, I'm not an expert on this, but that's partly where I think some of our attention should go, in addition to the geopolitics and the threat Iran does pose to the region and to Israel. Yeah.
Several of the questions were about Project 2025 and what threat it poses to our own democracy. So I'd like to ask you about that and to explain what Project 2025 is.
Well, I'm not an expert on Project 2025. I've read that the Heritage Foundation, which is in Washington, and I've worked with people there over the years, has developed a roadmap, a conservative roadmap for the next president, as I understand it. And I did try and read the report, but it wasn't available during the coffee break, because you told me this question. But there's 3 people identified with it. But the headlines around it are ones that, whether conservative or liberal, I think are really disturbing, which is, as somebody who's worked in government, the beauty of our country's governance is the unbelievable expertise by people whose names you've never heard, who have a great sense of commitment to their job and argue ferociously with people who come in for shorter time periods, like myself, about the history, the details. This is how it works. Let's have a conversation. And a lot of what I read about 2025 is to basically help eradicate a huge chunk, or at least move a lot of the civil service people out of their jobs and make them political appointments. So I've been a political appointee, and I came in because I was seen as having expertise in my area. But man, the government keeps you on your toes, because you don't just get a pass, you get to write your own speeches. You have to engage with everybody else in the government, which can be military officers, civil affairs experts. You've got people who are career diplomats who've been all over the world, and you also have civil service who are hired because of their knowledge and deep expertise. So if you want to know about how a nuclear power plant works, or what our diplomatic relations with Yemen have been, or why we agreed to something in the NATO treaty of blah, blah, there is a human being who knows how to find the answer. And that's some of the power that the United States has. So whether conservative or liberal, I would not want to get rid of our core knowledge base that has helped fuel some of our successes around the world. Could it be improved? Absolutely. I think we're ready for a renewal of that whole pipeline. I want more young people excited about joining government, being problem solvers, being knowledge carriers, being part of that conversation. I think we prioritize looking at the top leadership of our government at all levels, and instead we should also be thinking about who's worrying about water quality or who's negotiating that trade agreement, and treat them as part of who represents us.
It's my impression that ever since the Ford administration, the politicization of the civil service has reached lower and lower, so that even office directors are appointed for political reasons. And that is discouraging, I think, to the kinds of young people you were talking about. Does the U.S. have any obligation to uphold the Geneva Convention? If so, how do we justify the funding of Israel while they continuously violate it by targeting hospitals and journalists and so on, doctors, along with the use of white phosphorus, a violation of protocol? Can you handle, this is a more specific question that Tori and I talked about briefly, which is the double standards question. we won't oppose as, the good guys, but we ally ourselves with people who are not such good guys. Henry Kissinger thought that Americans supported foreign policy more if it had a moral content on it. So every president makes the promotion of human rights a priority. But here we have the situation involving Israel where the country is somewhat divided on that. I wonder if you could comment on, not on how it's going to come out, but on what effect it's having in our diplomacy.
So I'm not an international lawyer, and I always enjoy listening to them explain to me the Geneva Conventions and all the protocols and how it works. So broadly speaking, we are a party to some of the Geneva Protocols and international human rights and humanitarian law, but not all of the provisions, even when we abide by them. And I do not have that whole list in my head. But I think what you're speaking to is a basic principle that we support war that there are rules of war. And the U.S. military is quite famous for taking this very seriously. We don't always do it appropriately, but rules of engagement require proportionality, distinction, that if civilian harm is going to be part of an attack on an enemy or its infrastructure, that is calculated ahead of time. There's a decision made that the harm to the civilians is justified by the military gain, and this is all part of the world we've lived in. And most nations have their own way of interpreting that IHL and basically applying it in the field. And I will just say recently, Secretary Austin, who's our Secretary of Defense, had put a real higher priority prior to the current October 7th attack on Israel of something called civilian harm mitigation. It's pretty phenomenal. It says, if the U.S. is involved in a war, a legal war, we will track harm to civilians, we will support reparations, we will think about our targeting to reduce that harm. So the U.S. has actually been pushing into this space, partly out of the challenges we experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, partly led by military leaders themselves who said, we might win short run, but we're not going to win the war if civilians only experience harm to themselves. There's a whole world of discussion about this, and I think it actually is huge progress the more we can think about it. So it's in that context that I might talk about the relationship with Israel, which we've seen the United States back and forth with Israel. I think on the books, many countries see Israel as having very strong rules of engagement and belief in international humanitarian and human rights law, but I think the practical effects with the number of civilians killed has led many to question how that's actually being applied in this case in Gaza. As I noted, 35,000 people have been recorded as dead. We've seen the pictures. So that disjuncture is quite severe. Even though we support Israel, I think there's been criticism of how they've conducted the war against Hamas and what recovery from this will look like, part of a larger conversation. Just one last thought. Early on in my career, I was asked to give I was thinking about Somalia, because the U.S. went into Somalia in 1992 under the first President Bush, and he did so because there was a famine. And he sold it to the American people as a humanitarian mission. And I learned later when I was at the Naval War College and heard a lecture by one of the military guys involved, was that he had asked how he got the Balkans out of the news cycle. And they said, well, you could do Somalia. So I think this is documented. So anyway, the point is, he sold to the American people, we're doing a humanitarian mission. And this is between when he lost the election and when Clinton came into power. So Clinton inherits this, and quickly got involved in the politics of Somalia, sent U.S. forces in, a peacekeeping mission was deployed, and famously, Black Hawk Down happens, where American militaries, members of the American military were killed in Mogadishu. Suddenly it's in the news. And what had happened was the humanitarian reason to go in and the actual effects of the conflict were not briefed to Congress. And so that showed what Henry Kissinger was saying, that if you sell it on moral reasons, I would add to Kissinger's, you also have to show why it benefits national security interests. So I would augment to say, yes, moral, but you also have to tell the American people, if we're using force, how it serves our interests, what the strategic goals are, and wed them together. My point being, Somalia, I think, was seen as a failure without having that.
There was only one question, surprisingly, on a country that's gotten a lot of attention, and that's China. The question is, the Chinese are focused on development through BRICS. That's the Brazil, Russia, India, anyway, I'm forgetting. SCO, Belt and Road,
Yeah,
and so on, especially the Belt and Road has gotten a lot of attention. So the question is, we focus on military and security almost exclusively. How can we succeed? The BRICS, of course, include China, that's the C, and S is South Africa. So this opens up, I mean, if I can ask you to elaborate more on this, this opens up our failure, in my judgment, to present the best of ourselves. We, of course, preserve honesty and openness. We don't censor our new government press releases or anything of that kind. But we are not presenting ourselves as well as we could around the world. And I wonder if you agree with that.
That's a huge question.
We have lots of time.
I think we're out.
3 o'clock.
Part of the premise is what the world thinks of us, which I cannot claim to know. However, I think the United States public often doesn't know all we do in the world. So your point about us being seen as primarily a military force, I think is incorrect. Now, I worked at the State Department. I hung out with the diplomats. I was with the people who were trying to do everything from police reform to support to humanitarian assistance to supporting something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which most people have never heard of. But the whole world agreed a few years back that by 2030, there were 17 goals that we were all going to, as a collective, try and reach. Everything from climate mitigation, access to energy, peaceful and just societies, go on and on. That's all on more of the economic and social development side. Do we have that in the news? Do you know we have American leaders all over the world working on this? Do you know that our embassies are supporting this? No, we don't. And I've had this conversation with some friends who are on the left side who said we should get out of Afghanistan, we should get out of Iraq. And I said, okay, what about everything else? What is your theory of how the U.S. does operate in the world? And one colleague's like, well, why do we even need to be there? And I was like, really? You just see only war, and I see all the complexity of this. So I think first point, we don't do a good job talking about what we do in the world that is not military. And we don't always do it well, but sometimes we do it phenomenally well, and it's all of it. So on the BRICS, many years ago, I think it was my first trip to Beijing for the government was in 2009, and I went back in 2010 because Secretary Clinton was leading something called the Strategic Economic Dialogue with China, and she brought like 200 of us. And we were trying to inch forward to conversations with China. And so the panel I was in charge of leading, which had some military officers in the room, was on China's role in peace operations, which at the time was road building in Eastern Congo, and that was kind of it. And so I look back and realize we were sort of condescending. We're like, hey, China, why don't you do more? And so they're like slowly saying, okay, okay. And I remember talking to one of my Chinese colleagues, and they're like, we have a plan. You'll watch out, or not watch out, but look out. I'm like, okay. Fast forward 4 or 5 years. I go back to Beijing for a conference on peacekeeping, and they have totally flooded the zone.
Totally what?
Flooded the zone. They have uniformed and civil servants all over UN missions. They have senior military officers in uniform speaking at this conference with knowledge and expertise. They are funding things. And to your point about BRICS, is like they invested in the soft power and the hard power of this institution. And I was a bit taken aback because the US doesn't provide military peacekeepers. I think we have less than 50 around the world out of a force of 77,000. We were behind on our funding. Our diplomats were fantastic. We had good training programs, but it's like, wow, they have really accelerated. So I think BRICS is one area of power. Brazil, Russia, India,
China,
South Africa, yeah, a number of countries who are looking for a different system outside to compete with the United States, potentially to push back on our call for rule of law, democracy, want more sovereign authority. And I think that we need to roll up our sleeves and be aware of that and engage. The peacekeeping is just one example.
China also initiated the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, so that leads to the next group of questions about globalization. and regionalism. Some say that globalization is dead, you know, that it was oversold and it's dead because of global institutions are being bypassed in favor of regional and sub-regional and bilateral agreements. And trade protectionism and for security reasons and other reasons is on the upsurge. So is the review of international investment, incoming investment. So there's an argument there that we should think, we, the United States, should think more regionally and bilaterally and not support global institutions to the extent that you and I might like. The World Trade Organization, for example, has been hampered by U.S. refusal to name another judge for the appellate panel. So looking at globalization versus regionalism as a sort of broad choice, what are your comments?
I don't think there's a clear single answer to that. I think globalization, we quickly learned, had harmed and disaffected huge swaths of populations, both the United States, in democracies, and around the world for its economic effects. On the other hand, it's the world we live in, and I was reading recently that many middle and even lower income countries are like, hey, we want to trade with you. We do not want to just be in our regional bloc. And so I think it's something we're going to negotiate our way through. You're more expert on the World Trade Organization than I am. But two examples. When COVID struck and we needed an international response to the pandemic, we had fairly clunky international organizations. And I give credit to Kendall Hoyt, a professor at Dartmouth, for helping me understand this better. But she said through Operation Warp Speed, we quickly, which was in the Trump administration, put together a vaccine and supply chain from something like 50 different countries participating in this, between the manufacturing capability, the research, and all of that. And it wasn't out of ideology, it was out of necessity. So in a sense, I see that as a globalization you have to have a global approach to a future pandemic if we're going to solve it. Another area where this is coming up is our effort to have reliable energy sources.
To do what, sorry?
Have reliable energy.
Energy, yeah.
And so a version of protectionism might be something called friend shoring, where the U.S. will choose to primarily trade with nations with whom we're friendly and create secure supply chains, say, for everything from solar panels to other technology for energy. So I guess I wouldn't necessarily say yes or no to that question.
We would love to hear some details from your experience about R2P. This is shorthand for responsibility to protect. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it took off after the Rwanda massacre, and I know that Samantha Powers and others feel strongly about that. I wonder if you could elaborate on it. Do we have time?
Yeah, the concept of responsibility to protect, I don't know if anyone here has heard of this before. Probably not, maybe. So in the 90s, there was a real concern that intervention to save lives, humanitarian intervention, was first of all a terrible phrase. Humanitarians hated it. You're going to use military to save lives. But second, it was very unregularized. What were the rules? You intervene in Kosovo and the Balkans to stop mass atrocities. You don't intervene in Rwanda in 1994 to stop a genocide. And so the former Secretary General of the UN, supported by an international commission, said, we got to get a principle lined up here. And so I'll give credit to Australia's former Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, who is a force of nature, if you haven't met him.
I know who he is.
Did you? Maybe you worked with him. So they put this panel together, and they said, okay, let's recast this. We're going to establish that every nation in the world has the sovereign responsibility to protect its own people. Point one. And it's pretty hard to find a country that's going to argue with that, right? The second, though, is if they're failing to protect their own people from atrocity crimes, and they were named as ethnic cleansing, genocide, mass atrocities, broadly speaking, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, Not all of those have legal definitions, by the way. Then the country is responsible to protect their people specifically from those mass atrocities. Again, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. And if they fail to do so, the commission said the world needs to step in. And so it tried to create a framework where, while sovereign responsibility is recognized by the UN, by the international community, there was this clause that said if you fail to take care of your people, that could trigger intervention. So first put the nation on the hook, and then second, other countries could come in. So that was adopted by the Security Council, the General Assembly, many countries in 2005, but they modified it to say countries are responsible for their own people. They named the 4 atrocity crimes, but they said you don't have to step in, but the world could step in. And I think this is important because even right now, where you're not seeing as much stepping in, that framework is still very real. Governments are responsible to protect their people. It's sort of baked into governance, except when they're at war with them. And that, I think, is where they become potential threats to international peace and security, and the international system has many mechanisms. So I won't get into it, but there's early warning projects that look at potential violence escalation in countries against populations, ethnic groups, religious minorities. That is tracked all the time. It can become part of an international diplomatic conversation. UN missions, I've mentioned this, including NATO missions, have a responsibility to protect civilians where they're operating, including from third parties. So if there's a marauding group, a military force may need the tools and capability to step in and protect those people. And I think that the global level, we will have to return to this concept, much as it's not been cited in the last few years, given the crises in places like Libya, Syria, and elsewhere. But last thought, there was a group called the Atrocity Prevention Study Group. It was run by Madeleine Albright and Bill Cohen, and it was feeding into the election period of McCain and Obama. And so the Obama administration is elected, and it laid a roadmap out, and it said, first, you need an intelligence estimate of where potential atrocities are. Then you need a long-term conflict prevention strategy and get our embassies thinking about this. You need a response capability. If there are military options, you need to think about doctrine, rules of engagement, training, and then what the international role is. And so the US government developed most of those tools. To this day, you can go talk to the intelligence community and they will look and say, these are countries at highest risk of internal conflict like this. You can go to the CSO Bureau. They have a Global Fragility Act that funds tracking states, countries at highest risk through diplomatic means. You have whole offices at the international level who think about means and ends if you're trying to address a conflict like this. Last point, if you were to intervene in a Rwandan genocide, that was people killing each other with machetes, so you don't send in a no-fly zone, right? We did do a no-fly zone in Libya. So the means and ends from a military operational point of view is also something that is a work in progress to sort out. The Army did develop, they were doctrine on this, both at the strategic, operational, and tactical level. So I think it's a work in progress. It's sort of a teenager as far as an idea goes. I think it's been set back by the conflicts I was mentioning, but I think we will return to it.
You mentioned embassies in passing, and we have an extraordinarily high number of senior-level positions at State Department and AID that have not been confirmed, that are used as political hostages in the Congress. And so roughly between 25 and 35% of our embassies have no ambassador, no U.S. ambassador at all. Yeah, it's that high, wow. And it's been like that for quite a while. So I raise this because when you're in the world of atrocities, we have an instinct, well, we won't talk to that person, he's a very bad dictator. And others say, well, it's time to face up to reality. If you're going to get anywhere with country X, you have to talk to the bad guy. But we tend to rely on intermediaries, maybe, instead of doing this ourselves. I mean, are we striking the right balance between activism and shunning?
I think there's a couple things in your point. Congress sometimes has few tools to affect foreign policy. So they've increasingly turned to holding up nominations as a means of getting attention of the administration. right? Tried and true. I've talked about Ambassador Holbrooke, but I'll say his nomination back in, what was it, 99, to be the ambassador to the UN was held up by then Senator Biden and Senator Helms. And Biden said, I'll hold the hearing, but you got to adopt my policy on U.S. funding to the United Nations and all the conditions we've applied. Like, so the idea of Congress negotiating over nominations is not new. I think what you're pointing to is the scale and the longevity. Because I always want an American in an ambassador role. I want them confirmed. I want them being seen as a representative of the president and our country. Because yes, the role of diplomacy is often talking to those you disagree with, not just your friends. And so on an international stage, if you don't try, you won't succeed. I remember hearing the story of, there was a woman who was in charge of, I mentioned earlier, trying to stop sexual violence. And she had this great title, Special Representative Secretary General. And someone reported back to me that she had marched up, in the best sense, to the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo and said, you are better than this. Your troops, we should be respecting them. Look what they've done. I'm sure you can fix this. This is terrible. And she put him on the spot. And no kidding, he put out a message like, thou shalt not use rape as a means of war. So sometimes just the engagement can move the needle on things in a very powerful way.
The question is along the lines of support for the UN. So it reads like this: please elaborate on the U.S. reduction of support for the UN and its agencies such as UNESCO. When did this start? Why is it happening? Who is responsible for this reduction? And why hasn't the Biden administration restored support? Just a little more detail than you just gave us.
So the U.S. has had a complicated role with UN on its funding for a long time. And some of it is because, as I mentioned, Congress wants to get the attention of the executive branch. But I do feel it's wandered into a territory well beyond that. So different administrations have not supported UNESCO. I think, let me get my history right here. We pulled out of UNESCO, and then President Bush, his wife, Laura Bush, got very involved in restoring our membership in it. And that, I think, we came back in during the Obama years. And it was seen, why would we be an educational cultural organization? Some of this is tied to policies, as I mentioned, in the Middle East. And most member countries, most member states are more sympathetic to the Palestinians than the United States. So sometimes that's Congress drawing a line and not wanting to fund organizations that recognize Palestine. But I think it went too far in the last administration. We pulled out of the World Health Organization. We stepped down from the Human Rights Council. We stopped paying a lot of our dues to the UN more broadly. And I think that became normalized. And as I mentioned, it's back on the table right now with a vote in the House about whether to fully defund all UN organizations and agencies. I don't know if it will go forward, but I think it's a dangerous approach which misunderstands the United Nations. Now, you actually asked me why this happens. I think it's because the American people are not paying. Why would they know about this debate? It's not something that's easy to sell back. I think it's one of our flaws. It can hit social buttons that people get excited about. I remember there was a postcard campaign in the 90s that said, hey, if we support the UN, you won't be able to spank your children. And they're seizing sovereign land in the west of the United States as World Heritage Sites. Neither was true, but it got people very excited. So I think there's a lot of flaws in the UN, but let's have an argument about the ones that are real. So I am worried about this, and I get back to, I find a lot of people interested in foreign policy are very focused on the geopolitics, as they should, but the connection between how we manage conflict through these institutions and our support to it has kind of been disconnected from that conversation.
My dream defense secretary, Robert Gates, went to the Hill and said that I have more people in my military bands than the entire Foreign Service. And he made a case for diplomacy. Similarly, Ash Carter, when he was Secretary of Defense, said he'd rather have us join TPP than a whole tank battalion. I mean, there's a recognition that to be engaged in the world, you have to have non-military panoply of trained people and trained options. So that's just a little bit of advertising.
Well, no, just to add to your
Yeah.
point, there was a hearing where Gates sat next to Secretary of State Clinton.
Right, she was there. Yeah.
And she was there, and he said, "Fund her, so you don't need me."
Can-
Like,
I think that was fantastic. Of course, it didn't work very well. On the U.S. Presentation of its strengths, there was a U.S. information agency founded by President Eisenhower back in 1953. But in this euphoria of post-Cold War and so on, Congress, in its wisdom, abolished it in 1999. So we don't have the kind of institution or organization that can go out and correct some of the misinformation that you just cited. Delving a little more into the U.S. side of things, this question says, the Supreme Court has recently ruled that any action taken by an acting president as an official act is admissible and cannot face legal repercussions. How do we rectify this with, or how do we reconcile, I think, this with the concept of checks and balances? What is to stop the legal assassination of political opponents? The end of term limits, question mark. I thought I'd throw a little more drama into the discussion.
would you like to answer that one?
No. No, but it gets back to the double standards again, that we don't practice what we preach necessarily.
We've had a lot of conversation about that, I think, in the last decade or so, as we've seen social movements at home and, come to terms with how the United States is an imperfect country, that we have some of the best ideals of the world, and we all look around and say, hey, sometimes we don't live up to it, and we can do so much better. And that's a constant process, I think, of renewal for us. I think each of us could come up with our list of what we fear we haven't done well enough at, and modesty about how badly we've done, but also be proud of what we are constantly trying to achieve. So, yes, double standard. I have my list. You all have your lists, things you know that we need to fix. But what I appreciate is that it's an endless, important conversation. And in many ways, what I'm arguing for is let's keep moving forward. Let's keep having these debates. Let's figure out where the common ground is. Let's rebuild where we can, not just say, okay, we're done. Let's pack up and go home. Because I've seen us do great things.
We have a little time if you'd like to elaborate on anything you haven't been able to say.
I feel like I've been doing a lot of talking, thank you.
Well, that's why people are here, not to listen to me, but to listen to you.
Well, I just will say, I mean, I came of age when we were worried about nuclear war and was still fairly young when the Cold War ended. And so to have the chance to work at that very uncertain time on trying to think about what are the tools to anticipate, prevent, and respond to conflict, it was very humbling and powerful to me. And I can't tell you enough about how, on both the humbling and powerful part, was for me to travel to these conflict zones and see people who have like a flimsy document from the Security Council on their bulletin board trying to implement this. It's extraordinary, whether it's driving around with a woman in a Jeep in Kenya, or from Kenya, or one time we flew into Eastern Congo, and the Indian battalion greeted us, and then we got in these couple Jeeps and we drove down the road, and they were trying to protect a community where there had been mass rapes. And so we get there, and there's this disruption, and I'm with 5 people in this Jeep, and they get very quiet. And then they realize it's to greet us. And I get swept. I think they thought Oprah was coming. And the women pushed the men out and said, we want to tell her our story. And they went through a very painful explanation of how their village had been attacked, how there had been mass rapes. And then they said, thank you for coming, but thank you for sending the international peacekeepers and the local Congolese police who had deployed to protect the village. And they pressed these handwritten letters into my hand. And then you fly home, and I'm back in Washington. But that village is still there. So for every trip, you meet these people who are trying to put their lives back together. And I don't want us to forget that this matters, that we can make a difference. And it doesn't have to be the Americans alone. Matter of fact, most of the time, it's people from other countries who are also committed to these causes. And I think in the general approach, it's based on understanding how conflicts work. It's not just made up in New York. It's local, it's meant to be enduring, it's supporting resilience of the communities, And I don't want us to walk away from that.
The conflicts that you've referred to have given rise to a record number of internally displaced people and people fleeing their entire country. Is at the same time, countries that don't necessarily want to receive these people, even if they could, and some have received quite a few of these people. But could you say what the UN, if anything, is doing about that particular problem, whether they're fleeing environmental disaster or civil war or persecution of minorities, whatever it is? The numbers are not going down, and they talk about human suffering. It's really appalling.
This is also obviously an issue here at home, where we talk about migration and our own borders and refugees and IDPs. Most people fleeing go to neighboring states. They're not heading to North America. A lot of the refugees or IDPs are in places, Jordan and Lebanon in particular for the Middle East. A lot of people are fleeing right now. Sudan, Ukraine have high numbers. The conflicts in Libya, Yemen. Sudan's numbers are particularly high. And so they're not getting on planes, they're walking. And so their emergency capabilities set up for the short run. But what's happened is, as these conflicts become extended, the theory is that this is a short-term measure, and then refugees are supported in safe return. But increasingly, and we've met people who grow up in refugee camps, sort of like Dadaab in northern Kenya that was built up after the multiple years of conflict in Somalia. So I think the very framework of what we think about as displacement has shifted both in numbers and longevity and the capability to treat this as an emergency. But I will say that the United States has also worked very hard to try and open up countries to resettlement, not just here at home, but all over the world, and try and expand the number of countries that will welcome people from other countries. I don't know where that project stands now, but it really is a global challenge. And sometimes it's an immense benefit. I have met students at Dartmouth who are refugees, who come from conflict zones, and they're eager and amazing and ready to learn, and they have insights that are really, really fantastic. But what a life, not easy. One other point, I think the humanitarian movement increasingly has had to recognize that to deal with the displacement, you've got to deal with the causes. And so that's one reason I raised it, is like you go back to the roots of displacement. It is in great part conflict. It's increasingly potentially around climate changes. That's where you solve the problem, so that people who want to go home can go home and don't have to flee in the first place.
Yes, I've visited several refugee camps in northern Uganda for South Sudanese refugees, in Jordan for Syrian refugees, and I echo what you just said. They're stuck in these camps, often without transportation and without a work permit from the host government, but the talent is formidable. I remember meeting a woman who had gotten a master's degree in accounting from Makerere University in Africa, the best university, and she had a job, but she was unable to leave the camp because there was no transportation. At least she had a little space for a kitchen garden, but just harnessing the energy and the positive attitudes of people who uproot themselves could be exciting if we thought of people that way. Well, I think we've put you through enough, but I will save this question for the final one and invite you and the audience, for that matter, to answer the question. It is, if you had to use a movie title for your talk, what would you choose? Everything, Everywhere, All at Once? Dirty Dancing? Need to Dance, but who? It's something else? So while you're thinking about all of that, I want to encourage you to come the following week, when we will have a session, another very good session on let me get the title exactly right, Sharp Power and something. I had it written down. Anyway, sorry, I don't have it.
So I'll answer your movie question.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll give you the
One of my husband's favorite shows, it's not a movie. Well, first of all, it should be Everything, Everything, All at Once, yes. Was For All Mankind. and it's this alternative history of the space race. So I recommend it. But I think we are talking about issues that affect everybody, both the United States, but also all the people of the world. So maybe I pick that. Or Paddington, which is just, it's really about a refugee finding his way in London as a teddy bear and being taken in by skeptical but warm-hearted people. So I think that could be another one.
There you go. Okay, next week it's Autocracy's Rise, Sharp Power, and the Growing Threat of Democracy. And judging from the questions, I think you'll all be interested in that. And the speaker next week has become known for inventing the concept of sharp power, and he will, I'm sure, explain what that is. But in the meantime, I really put Tori through a lot of hoops, including some unexpected questions. So let's all join in thanking her for the time she's spent. That was terrific.
My pleasure, thank you. And come to the Dickey Center, too.
Yeah. The first time I came to that